A quick word of appreciation for this program, Works in Process. I think it's brilliant. The fact that we are afforded the opportunity to learn about the insights of the professions that we hold so dear to us. I applaud all those individuals who make this possible. With us tonight, we brought 2 of our musicians standing to my left, and also 8 of our dancers. And they're going to present for you some works that you may never have seen. My remarkable assistant, Doug Fullington, I remember when my checklist for being an assistant is, can you type? And he said yes, and then he mentioned his master's degree in music, his law degree, and his ability to read Stepanov notation and translate unseen ballets. I thought, this is going to work. But Doug is quite the Renaissance man at P&B, and for this program, he's pulled together some of the works by Marius Petipa. You'll see Le Roi Candaule, La Bayadere, and Le Corsaire. And I will turn it over to Doug.
Good evening, and thank you, Peter. How kind. We're so glad to be back here. We've put together a program of dances by the 19th century French choreographer Marius Petipa. And the thing all these dances have in common is that they're from ballets whose plots are set in exotic locales, or more correctly, what would have been an exotic locale for Western European audience. Le Corsaire, set in Turkey, Le Roi Candaule, set in the ancient kingdom of Lydia, which is now Turkey, and La Bayadere, set in India. These all represented the Orientalism that so fascinated Europe throughout the 19th century. And while they were Orientalist in plot, and in scenic design, and in costume design, the dance, nevertheless, was the danse d'école. It was classical ballet, French ballet, and only occasionally did the dance make a nod toward exoticism in a character dance, or a dance for a character specifically from the country of the locale of the ballet. And also, all the titles are in French. So we will show you ballet tonight, but drawn from these wonderful 3 ballets mostly by Petipa. Le Corsaire goes back to Paris. We'll talk about that a little bit, and we're finding more and more as we research. We're not sure where Petipa began and where the French before him ended. Somewhat of a gray area, and I'll try and point those things out. Very happy to have 8 dancers from the company with us tonight, but also very happy to have 2 musicians from our orchestra. We have our concertmaster, Michael Jinsu Lim, with us, and our associate concertmaster, Brittany Bolden. In addition to the dances, which we have reconstructed from the Stepanov choreographic notation method, these notations are held as part of the Harvard Theater Collection. The collection also holds a number of rehearsal scores from St. Petersburg. These scores are called repetiteurs. The full score of the ballet would be arranged for 2 violins so that it could be rehearsed in the studio with 2 violinists. Piano wasn't used until early in the 20th century. So we have taken the 2 violin scores for these ballets, and that is the accompaniment that you will hear tonight. And Michael and Brittany are going to play you an example, and for those of you that read music, you may have deduced what this page is from up here on the screen, and if not, you will know what it is as soon as you hear it. So let's take a listen to this excerpt from a violin rehearsal repetiteur. And I wish it would go on. Thank you. That's the only bit we have access to of Swan Lake, but For that reason, we'll move right on into Le Corsaire. We'll take the ballets in chronological order as they were originally produced. Le Corsaire, as I mentioned, premiered not in Russia, but in Paris in 1856, and the original choreography was by Joseph Mazilier. As with most Parisian ballets that were successful, they were exported right away to St. Petersburg, which had its eye on Paris, on Parisian culture, music, and ballet. Petipa was involved with that 1858 production. It was under the direction of Jules Perrault. And then in 1863, Petipa staged his own production of Corsaire, and so on until his last production, finally in 1899. So you can see over the years, different choreographers had a hand in the staging. We don't know where Mazilier left off, what Perrault might have added that Petipa kept, and so forth. But we give Petipa most of the credit, I suppose because he gave it the most years. After the ballet was produced for the last time under Petipa in 1899, much of the ballet was recorded in Stepanov notation, and so you will see in our versions tonight those based on the 1899 production as best as we can tell. The story is a swashbuckler. It's based on loosely based on Byron's poem, The Pirate, Le Corsaire. You'll meet some of the characters later, but we're going to show you a purely classical ballet excerpt from the third act of the Russian version. This is the Pas de Trois des Odalisques. Now, an odalisque was a harem slave. It's very much part of the Orientalist plot of the ballet, but again, the choreography, pure ballet, and we can see Petipa's wonderful balance. Very rarely does he repeat himself in the steps that he gives the women. We have an entree for all three women, very cleverly put together, a variation for each that follows, and then a coda, a final dance for all three. You're going to be seeing Amanda Clark, who will dance the first variation, Lida Biasucci, who will dance the second variation, and Leora Neuville, who will dance the third variation. So now let's enjoy the Pas de Trois des Odalisques from Le Corsaire. We'll go back now to an earlier scene in the ballet, the second act, or the grotto scene as it's called in the Russian version, where we meet our two leading dancers, Conrad, leader of the pirates, and Medora, our heroine. He has just saved her from being sold to the Pasha by kidnapping her and taking her to the pirate's lair. And in this scene, he'll be showing her the wonders of pirate life. We have some imagery from the Mazilier production in Paris of these two in this scene, and it's very close to what was notated in Petipa's version of 1899. So again, a gray area. We don't know how far back the production goes. I'm quite certain that some of it stems back further than Petipa, who more and more we find out was taking from productions he knew from his youth or from travels to Paris, as any stager did of the popular ballets in their time. I'd like to read you a description of this scene as it was published in the 1899 libretto that the audience would have received in St. Petersburg. It says, "The canopy is opening. Medora is reclining on a sofa with Conrad sitting at her feet. Conrad, after letting a maid depart, offers to share his supper with Medora and brings her to the table to serve her. She refuses and instead asks to serve the supper to him. He accepts. While dancing and entertaining him, Medora brings Conrad sorbet, wine, and a pipe. Conrad, seduced to the fullest by Medora's attractions, expresses excitement and embraces her while vowing his eternal love." Now, our reconstruction here is based on the notation, which differs in certain details from that printed libretto. When the lovers first come on stage, Conrad says, "Do you love me?" And Medora says, "Well, yes." And he says, "Because if you don't love me, I'm going to..." And she says, "No, no, don't do that. Let's go over and have something to eat." And then he just goes on, "You're so beautiful. Your eyes sparkle." That's a great one. How do you mime "your eyes sparkle"? Well, you'll see Seth Orza do this. Seth Orza will be dancing the role of Conrad and Leslie Rausch the role of Medora. And during the introduction to this scene, we're going to bring the screen in, and we're going to show you some images from the 1899 production. You will see two casts. You will see Marie Petipa, who is Petipa's daughter. She's in the first few slides, partnered by Sergei Legat. I think they were second cast. And then first cast, Pierina Legnani, who was the first Odette Odile in the famous 1895 production of Swan Lake, partnered by the famous Pavel Gert. So please enjoy these images as we show you the scène dansante from Le Corsaire. We're going to move on now to less charted territory with Le Roi Candaule, or King Candaulus. This is a ballet that Petipa choreographed right from the beginning. It premiered in 1868, one of the great exotic works, a very melodramatic plot. King Candaule was king of ancient Lydia, and throughout history was represented in writings and in art and in sculpture. In the 19th century as well, a historical fiction novel was published in the mid-century. This certainly may have influenced Petipa's decision to use the story of the ballet. He did keep up not only on what was going on in contemporary news, but also what was popular with the public, what was coming out in fiction, what was coming out in art, and he would take inspiration for his ballets from these varying subjects, and I'm sure that was the case here. The story concerns the arrogant King Candaule and his corrupt wife Nisia, and the warrior Gyges, who eventually takes the throne from Candaule, and so forth. So a very sort of heavily wrought plot. But throughout the ballet, as was often the case, are divertissements or entertainments whose pretexts have nothing to do with the plot of the ballet. And that is the case with this next dance. It's called Le Berceau du Papillon. And the women who are going to dance this have been very gracious and working out this ballet with me. In the notation, of course, we get the steps, we get some instructions, but not always a motivation behind them, not always the sort of scene setting that will help us understand what's going on here. We have 4 women in the corps de ballet. We have one leading woman, who is the butterfly, le berceau, or the cradle, or the birth of the butterfly. So we have a birth here of a butterfly, and we see that at the beginning, but this is a mischievous butterfly. The notation says she has to run from one to the next and hit them on the shoulder. Then she returns and she has to give them a hug. And so, of course, we're taking this very seriously and trying to figure out what was going on, realizing that wit is part of this business as well. So Lita Biasucci will dance the role of the butterfly, joined by Amanda Clark, Angelica Generosa, Leora Neuville, and Carly Samuelson, all of whom have worked together with me to put this back together. And I think this is the first time it will have been danced in who knows how many decades. So please enjoy Le Berceau du Papillon. Now we'll take a look at another dance further on in La Candaule. This is the pas de Diane, which in the 20th century would go on to become the famous Diana and Actaeon pas de deux. What we've done here is try and peel some of the layers back and see what this dance looked like, at least in part, earlier on. We believe that this dance was a pas de trois for Diana, who is the virgin goddess of the hunt, and Endymion, the hunter, who loved her. Now, they had an illicit relationship that was not allowed and were discovered by a satyr who makes up the third member of this pas de trois. The dance included an entree, which would be the introductory dance for Diana and Endymion, followed by the partnered adagio, and then variations for the satyr, which was a demi-character role, meaning that the dance was half ballet and half dance vocabulary outside of ballet, bent knees and things that would distinguish the satyr from the more, say, noble Endymion. Satyr would have his variation, then Endymion. Finally, Diana would have her variation, and then a coda for all three. This is, in part, how the dance is notated following the 1903 production of the ballet, which was Petipa's last. Petipa was, I believe, 85 years old at this time. It was 1 year before his forced retirement. They quit sending the carriage for him, and he could not go to work. But he supervised his productions up until he could no more, and this was one of them. You'll see in this photograph here Anna Pavlova, the famous Anna Pavlova. This was one of her roles, and she had it in her repertory for many years. This photograph was taken in 1907. You see she's Diana with her bow. And then if we go on to the next slide, we'll see that it's the same role, the same bow, but this is a photograph from 1900. So it was in her repertory early on in her career, and one that she liked, one that she kept in her repertory. Let's go on to the next slide. This is a painting, an 1840s painting by the St. Petersburg artist, if I can pronounce it correctly, Karl Bryullov. And perhaps it influenced Petipa in deciding to include this story as one of the entertainments in the ballet Le Roi Candaule, which you remember premiered in 1868, so just 20-some years after this painting was made. We see there Endymion and Diana and, of course, the satyr. Now, as I said, this dance has stayed in the repertory, but in a re-choreographed version by Agrippina Vaganova. She choreographed this dance in 1937 for her 1938 production of the ballet Esmeralda, where this dance now lives. She changed it from a pas de trois to a pas de deux, and it was still for Diana, but now for Actaeon, not for Endymion. And the story there, we're still not clear why the character changed. It does sort of mix mythologies, if you will. And she also added roles for 12 corps de ballet women. So the dance changed significantly. What we've been able to put together from the notation for you tonight is the entree, the adagio, the satyr variation, and Diana's variation. We have no record of Endymion's variation, sadly, and only bits of the coda. We might tackle the coda sometime in the future, but it will take a lot of editorial work here. I do want to give a shout out of thanks to Kyle Davis, who will dance the satyr role, who worked with me closely on putting together his dance. We do know that George Balanchine performed the role of the satyr, and if we look at this next slide, there's a young Balanchine in 1922, just 18 years old, in a pastel. This is usually ID'd as a costume for Bacchus from the ballet Le Roi Candaule, and perhaps that's the case. However, satyrs were the attendants to Bacchus, so perhaps this is closer to the satyr costume that he would have worn. Balanchine excelled in demi-character roles. It certainly makes perfect sense that he would have danced the role of the satyr. So we'll go ahead and watch this dance. You will see Leslie Rausch as Diana, bow in hand for her variation, Seth Orza as Endymion, and Kyle Davis as the satyr. Our third ballet is La Bayadere, still very much in the repertory today. First performed in 1877 in St. Petersburg with choreography by Petipa. It was the most popular of his exotic ballets, and as I said, still in the repertory today. It went through a number of productions in St. Petersburg. Petipa's final contribution to it, his final production, was in December of 1900. And fortunately for us, the ballet was in large part very carefully notated. For many of these dances, we only have notations for feet and legs and a ground plan. Now, the feet and legs are notated rhythmically so we can match them to the music, but we still have to make a large editorial contribution. We have to decide on head and arms and torso and épaulement and other elements. With La Bayadere, it's very carefully notated, even down to the wrist. Lots of Fred Astaire wrists. And they were very carefully notated. An X on a certain line shows you that the wrist is flexed in that way. So we've tried very hard in what we've prepared for you tonight to be as faithful as we can to the notation. The story concerns Nikia, who is a Bayadere, a temple dancer. She is in love with Solor, a famous warrior, who in turn is betrothed to Gamzati, the Raja's daughter. So there's our triangle, and there's our problem, and that is how the plot will unfold. Gamzati conspires to kill Nakia. She puts a snake in her flower basket, and so poor Nakia. But Solor does meet her later in a dream in what's called the Kingdom of the Shades. The shades, the shadows. Nakia appears as a ghost among many sort of duplicate Nakias. In Petipa's production of 1900, there were 48 women that were part of the Kingdom of the Shades, 48 shades. That is a stage full. We're going to have 4 shades tonight. But they can do all the choreography, and we show you as much of the patterns as we can within that plan. You will see Leora Neuville as Nakia and Seth Orza as Solor. And we're going to show you excerpts from this scene. We're going to show you the pas de deux that's accompanied by the corps de ballet. If you're familiar with Kingdom of the Shades, you know that after the famous entry as the shades snake down the slopes of the Himalayas, that Solor enters, and there is a pas de deux just with Nakia, and then right away a second pas de deux accompanied by the corps de ballet, and that's where we'll begin tonight. We'll follow that with 4 variations in the coda, and I'll speak a little bit in between each to give you an idea of where we are. If you're familiar with the current version of La Bayadere, you may notice some differences in the partnering for this adagio. So we'll start there, the adagio from La Bayadere, the Kingdom of the Shades. Now we'll continue on with the 4 variations that follow the adagio. And these are the same 4 that you're used to seeing today, but with some differences. The first is the polka variation, which I think differs here in simply number of repetitions of combinations. It's very densely filled with steps. The central section isn't quite as slow as performed today. The steps are done more quickly. That'll be danced by Leah. Then Angelica will dance the cabriole variation, which is variation number 2, also known as the Vaganova variation, because it was one of the famous variations danced by Agrippina Vaganova, who must have been quite a jumper. That variation remains quite close to how it's performed today. The third variation is the slow one, but we find by looking at the metronome tempo markings in period scores that the music was played much faster than it was played today. Anna Pavlova danced this variation in 1900. The reviews said she flew through the air on her jumps, which doesn't quite correspond to how we think of this variation today, which is such an exercise in control. But we will play it at the faster tempo, danced by Carly. And then Leora will dance Nikia's variation. Today, this variation begins as a potata. A soloist is on stage holding one end of a long tulle scarf, and Nikia holds the other end. Originally, Nikia was the only one on stage holding the scarf, and the other end was connected up in the fly space, so that when she did a final arabesque in the middle section, she would let go, and the scarf would travel upwards. The original Nikia mentions this in her memoirs. Tamara Karsavina mentions this in her memoirs. I had the privilege of speaking with some dancers who worked with Nikolai Sergeyev, who taught for the notations, who gave me the same information. And we don't have that fly space set up tonight. Leora is going to give it a nice toss, but just imagine that it's going to fly upwards, a magical moment. So we will go ahead and start with the first variation, and we will dance them uninterrupted, variations 1 through 4. We'll take a look at the coda now. The coda is the final dance that follows this whole group of dances. It's in the faster tempo. It has the bravura steps. We're only going to show you this, I guess we'd say, the second and third parts. There's an opening for the corps de ballet and the soloist, and then there's a wonderful entrance for Nikia and Solor. And this is a passage that reminds me so much that La Bayadere is not just a classical ballet, meaning a ballet with geometric architecture and rhetorical repetition of combinations, but it also is just as much a romantic era ballet about an elusive shade, an elusive woman that the man can't quite grasp. And we certainly will see this in the opening section in the middle of the coda here, where Nikia is flying across the stage and Solor can only hold her for a moment and off she goes again. And then we'll have the final section beginning with the corps de ballet and a wonderful entrance by Nikia. I think you'll find and see that the steps are much different than we're used to seeing today. It's been a lot of fun to put this back together again. So let's watch these excerpts from the coda from the Kingdom of the Shade scene. Our final two excerpts are from the last act of Bayadere, Act 4, which is subtitled Revenge of the Gods. Gamzadi perseveres, and the wedding goes forward Solor comes out of his dream. He's going to marry Gamzati, but at the wedding, the shade of Nikia appears, only visible to Solor, but Gamzati knows something is not right. Petipa has choreographed here what he called a pas d'Actaeon, or a dance with action. And a pas d'Actaeon was often the central dance of any act or scene of one of Petipa's ballets. In it, classical dance would be melded with the action. So we will see here that 4 Bayadères dance. The notation says they should be from the good soloists. They dance, and then we have the dramatic elements. We will have an entrance for Gamzati, and here is another interesting twist. As was often the case with the male roles in ballet in the late 19th century in St. Petersburg, the seasoned dancer would do the partnering and would do the pantomime. He had the artistic expressiveness and the experience, but a younger male dancer would do the heavy dancing roles, and that was the case here. In 1900, Solor was danced by Pavel Gert, who back in 1877 did the dancing as the young dancer to Lev Ivanov, who was Solor. But in 1900, it was Gert. Nikolai Legat, who was brother to Sergei Legat, they were two of these sort of up-and-comers, stepped in to do the dancing. He was referred to just as cavalier. They would both be on the stage sometimes at the same time, essentially 2 Solors, and apparently the audience did not have a problem with this, and neither did Petipa. It sort of came down to practicality, and maybe the classical side of things really did take over then, dance architecture. We're going to see 2 excerpts from the pas d'Actaeon. We'll look at the entree, which is quite involved, and we'll stop and talk a little more and look at the coda. In the entree, as I said, we begin with 4 Bayadères, then we have an entrance for Gamzati and the cavalier. Then Solor Pavel Gert, who will be danced by Seth Orza, will step in as Nikia enters. Another interesting story, the first Nikia, Katerina Vazyom, in 1877, butted heads with Petipa constantly. He would give her steps for this last act. He was in a hurry, and she would reject them. Nope, not going to dance it, not going to dance it. He finally said, if you can't dance this, what can you dance? Well, she took her stuff and left rehearsal, came back the next day, gave her some more steps. No, you can't dance them. He finally said, do what Madame Gorshenkova does. Well, she was dancing Gamzati, and she was a real jumper. Vazyom was not a jumper. Fast footwork, very intricate beats was her forte. So Petipa was really trying to get at her. But she took the challenge, and you'll see it in Nikia's entrance. Grand jetés from the downstage wing. She writes about them in her memoirs, and there they are in the notation of 1900. Very exciting. So let's go ahead and watch this entree from the pas d'Actaeon of Bayadere Act 4, The Wedding, and you will see our different characters. Leora will be Nikia, Leslie Rausch as Gamzati, Seth Orza as Pavel Gert, Solor, and Kyle Davis as Nikolai Legat, Cavalier. All right. after that entree would be an adagio and variation solos. Those are not notated, so we won't have them for you tonight, but we do have the coda, which I just love. It begins with the 4 Bayadères, one at a time, each down the stage with sotobasques and chaînés. And then we move into an entrance for Gamzadi. And then we have a section, wonderful section for the Cavalier and the 4 Bayadères, 12 entrechats in a row with arms around the waist. And then just such an interesting ending. We have one final entrance for Gamzadi, partnered by Solor, Pavel Gert. And she just comes across the stage bourring, but the notation shows how her face is downcast. And we just get a final picture of this unhappy woman who knows the man she's going to marry doesn't really love her. And then the Cavalier will partner Nikia in flying steps and double pirouettes that end with hands crossed over the chest and the head down and to the side. So we get these pictures of the emotions, but given to us through the medium of classical dance. And I guess that really is the true pod Actaeon, that melding of the dance with the emotion. Following the coda, we'll move immediately to the finale music. We're not going to stage an earthquake for you, but we're going to show you some images from the ballet, some images from 1900, some drawings from 1877, and then we get to the apotheosis. In the apotheosis, after the temple has been destroyed, the gods have their revenge. Solor and Nikia are reunited, flying through the rain up above the Himalayas. And that will be our final image for you. So these will be my last words. I just want to say thank you very much for being such a warm audience. Thank you to Mrs. Cronson and the Works in Process program. Now please join with our musicians and our dancers as you enjoy the coda, the finale, and the apotheosis of La Bayadere.